Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is visiting the U.S., where he has been lauded for his leadership on climate change only years after a ban on his travel to the U.S. was lifted. What's driving U.S.-India ties today? And 40 dead tiger cubs. Thailand's now infamous Tiger Temple is accused of running an animal trafficking network and slaughterhouse. How can we ensure the safety and rights of captive animals? And we start today's show with India and U.S. ties. On Monday, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi started his three-day visit to Washington, and the visit, concluding on Wednesday, is likely to see a close ties between the two countries.
The seventh meeting between President Barack Obama and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. An important development this time regarding nuclear status.
I indicated our support for India becoming part of the nuclear suppliers group.
In some way,
the help and support that my friend President Obama has extended is something that I will always cherish.
The NSG would allow India to sell nuclear technology. China and several other members oppose India's entry because it has not signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Meanwhile, it's been announced that U.S. company Westinghouse will build 6 nuclear reactors in India.
The notable development on the defense side was the willingness of the United States, which was conveyed during the course of the meeting, to recognize India as a major defense partner.
Security cooperation was further discussed as U.S. Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter called on Modi at the president's guest house. The Indian leader also spoke confidently about India's economic prospects.
I'm happy to tell you that today India is poised as a new engine of global growth. A larger Indian economy has multiple benefits for the world.
It's Modi's 4th state visit to the U.S. after taking office in 2014. But Wednesday marks the first time Modi has been invited to address a joint meeting of Congress in the House chamber, an honor bestowed on just a few world leaders every year. The visit is expected to bring the two nations ever closer.
For more on the Indian Prime Minister Modi's visit to the United States, I'm joined here in the Beijing studio by Ms. Li, who is an Associate Research Fellow at the Institute of South and Southeast Asian Studies of China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Welcome to our program. Meanwhile, joining us from New Delhi in India, we're having Mr. Madhav Nalapat, a UNESCO Peace Chair and also Director of the Geopolitics and International Relations Department, Manipal University. Welcome, Professor Nalapat. Also joining us from Washington, D.C. in the U.S., we're having Mr. Jeff Smith, Director of Asian Security Programs at the American Foreign Policy Council. Welcome. So, what about the visit? NSG, which is supposed to be one of the most important things on the agenda. Professor Nalapat, why is India so eager to join the nuclear suppliers group? What exactly is at stake?
Well, the fact is that India has a very substantial nuclear industry. It has built up this industry over the last 50 years, and it's entirely built up by its own industry and by its own scientific pool. So I think India has got a lot to contribute to the world in terms of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, for example, or the peaceful use of the atom. Now, by being a member of the NSG, India will be enabled to be on the same platform as other major powers, and as a consequence there will be far more interaction between India and other major powers, including the US and China.
I see. Mr. Smith, since President Obama already calling Prime Minister Modi as a partner and friend, Prime Minister Modi calling Mr. Obama a friend, can US using its swaying power to convince India to join Non-Proliferation Treaty and therefore make India eligible to join the NSG eventually?
Well, and President Obama has taken a different approach And what the United States has been trying to do is to carve out an exemption for India to join the nuclear suppliers group without joining the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That is not a necessary prerequisite to join the NSG. There have been members in the past, non-NPT members, who have joined the NSG. And I think the United States is making the case that India's non-proliferation record is quite exemplary compared to perhaps some others in the region. And in fact, many countries agree with the United States that India meets the requirements set forth by the NSG, although, as you mentioned, there is still some disagreement, and I know that Beijing feels differently.
Well, I guess Beijing does feel differently. So are some of the other countries who are already members of the NSG. Just to explain to our viewers what NSG is about. It's a specific organization made up of 48 members. Every one of them claims that they are going to use the nuclear reactor, the nuclear energy in a peaceful way, not diverting them to any other kinds of usage. After saying this, let me come to you, Ms. Lee. Would the United States' efforts of making an exception for India necessarily going to be the role that other countries can also tread in the future when they want to join NSG? And will NSG still be NSG if that is the case?
Yeah, so I think that's why that's what the Chinese concern is about, because at the moment, according to my understanding, every member in the NSG now have already signed the NPT. Yeah, so from the Chinese side, actually, China does not, is not against the peaceful use, the right of peaceful use of the nuclear energy from the Indian side. The problem, I think, is about the credibility of this, non-proliferation regime.
For example, Professor Modi, the people could argue, if India does that, why can't Pakistan? Or some of the other countries in the regions and beyond. Professor Modi, very briefly from you. Will the friendship with Washington really carry things forward?
Well, I'm really optimistic that India will be joining the NSG. We have found that after, for example, the US and India nuclear agreement, China was initially hesitant, but subsequently supported India. Now, China is our most important neighbor, and China and India are the two largest developing countries in the world. And let's be honest, I don't think there's any comparison between India and any other country in the region. So I'm sure the Chinese appreciate that, like themselves, India is a major power and should be looked at as a separate entity from other countries in the region or outside. The United States has made that determination, and we in India expect our friends in Beijing to make the same determination.
Very interesting you mentioned about the role of China in its relations with India and also India's overall international role as a result. Mr. Smith, this is an interesting argument, isn't it? I mean, this time you see the U.S. strong interest into developing a stronger ties with India than it used to be. Many suggest it has a lot to do with the U.S. Policies of so-called rebalancing in Asia. Many believe here in this part of the world that it has a lot to do with the U.S. Image about China and U.S. future strategies against China. So can India, from your perspective, balance itself very well between Washington and Beijing?
Well, I think the U.S.-India embrace dates back much farther than the U.S. pivot to Asia. It really was in the early 2000s under the Bush administration, after the 9/11 terror attacks, that the U.S. and India began to consummate this strategic partnership, and it has advanced continuously since then. I think there's no question that some shared concerns about Chinese behavior is a motivating factor in the U.S.-India relationship. But so are some shared concerns about Pakistan's behavior, frankly. There's a wide array of factors underpinning U.S.-India relations, and I think both sides have made it clear on many occasions that in no way is the relationship designed to contain China or be offensive to Beijing.
Right. When it comes to international relations, it's all about national interests, isn't it? But let's go through some of these important national interest points, for example, between New Delhi and Washington. Ms. Li, first of all, China's role. Earlier, we heard already very clearly coming from Mr. Smith the analysis of it. But two things, at least the media reports are suggesting, bringing New Delhi and Washington ever closer. One is China's submarine so-called patrol in the Bay of Bengal, and many believe that that motivated India to get ever closer military relations with Washington. Secondly is the still existing territorial disputes between China and India, and therefore which brings New Delhi ever closer to Washington again. So how from China's perspective see these two so-called reasonings? And what would that mean for Beijing?
Yeah. Actually, in my understanding, there's no, problem for China that, U.S. and India, they, get closer to each other. I think as India is an emerging power, which, nobody can overlook it, today. So it's natural for U.S. to go to India, and also. U.S. is the leading power in the world nowadays, still is the leading power. So I think it's very natural for India and U.S. to go close. But in terms of the security issue, because as you know, for the rebalance power, the U.S. Official make it very clear they want India to be the linchpin of that rebalance. And also, several 2 months back, the U.S. Defense Secretary said that they want to have India to join U.S. to make a joint patrol in the South China Sea. This, I think, will make the situation very complicated.
Well, would that make it feel complicated, Professor Nalapat? What about that? We understand, just adding to what Ms. Li here said, U.S. and India signed several different levels of agreements concerning military exchanges, including the U.S. use of the Indian bases and also refueling and many other issues. Of course, that caused interest coming from Beijing and many others here in Asia included. So what exactly is New Delhi having in mind?
Well, I'd like to point out that those in India, or those in the United States for that matter, who are talking of a war with China, they're probably only in mental asylums. No sane person is going to talk in China, India, or the United States of a war between these countries. I don't think it's going to ever happen, because the relationship between China and the United States, for example, is much closer than the relationship between India and the US. The point is that we have been afflicted with Wahhabi terror, and so has the United States, so has the global community. And India has built up several strengths in the military field in confronting this kind of terror. India has built up a very good naval capacity. So from all these points of view, the two defense establishments are coming together, and I think this is an inevitable process that's going to take place over the next 3 or 4 years, irrespective of who's in power in Washington. Because after all, the threats that India faces are the same as the threats that the U.S. faces.
Mr. Smith, what do you think? Sometimes these kinds of ever closer relationship could bear some wonderful results, but other time it could unnecessarily or sometimes necessarily alarm the third party. This time China probably is involved.
Well, as I said, the two sides have on many cases reiterated that the relationship is not directed at China. And Beijing has itself reiterated on several occasions that it sees no problem with U.S.-India strengthening partnership. I think some of India's growing concerns, as you mentioned before, do relate to the presence now of the Chinese Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy, its growing profile in the Indian Ocean. China has much more robust relationship now with many of India's neighbors, including Sri Lanka and Nepal, and certainly its long-standing relationship with Pakistan. In some cases, this is a instance of growing spheres of influence of two rising powers that's creating some natural friction. Thus far, I think they've done a pretty admirable job in managing those tensions, but I don't think it's any surprise to see the United States and India coming closer together, nor is it necessary that that partnership be directed against China if we can address some of the more fundamental security concerns that all three capitals have.
All right. Will that be secure for China or more concerns from China, Ms. Lee?
Yeah, I think the point here is the transparency. I mean, because at the moment, we have to say that there's a mistrust between China and the U.S. and also a mistrust between China and India because of border dispute. So I think when India and U.S. get together, especially under the background of that rebalance strategy, I think both U.S. and India should make it more transparent, because today I read a report about a kind of action plan in the Asia Pacific. So, but the report said it will not make it public. So I think for China, we will think about what kind of action plan it will.
All right, very interesting over there. Not only about the strategic issues, but also about some very specific issues. For example, trade. U.S. and India's trade relations is getting ever closer. U.S. is one of India's largest trading partner. In 2006, U.S. exported $9.7 billion worth of goods to India and imported about $21.8 billion worth of Indian goods. A decade later, now we're having these figures more than doubled already. American imports, though, from India amounted to 2% of its overall imports and 15.3% of India's overall exports in 2015, though that's the number over there. Of course, the bilateral trade exploded, but more than the bilateral trade, we are seeing the climate change issue, also a big one, Mr. Smith. President Obama, of course, considering his legacy, one of them is a climate change issue, Paris Accord, of course. But that would not be implemented until those countries who are emitting about 55% of the overall world's emissions are committed to this. And will Prime Minister Modi's visit this time really bring the good news and the final good news in the near future?
Well, I'm sure President Obama is hoping so, and there certainly has been some movement on the climate change issue during Prime Minister Modi's visit. But frankly, that is one of among, 24 very important topics that have been covered since Prime Minister Modi has been here. Economics, as you mentioned, is certainly one of them, but it expands far beyond that to information exchange sharing agreements on aircraft carrier technology, to India's designation as a major defense partner, to the logistics exchange memorandum. Frankly, the joint statement between the two countries was many, many pages and many paragraphs long, and I think a demonstration of the breadth of cooperation. But no doubt climate change has been an important issue for President Obama, and I think he's been happy with the progress made thus far.
Okay, and Professor Nalapat, if India joins, that would be the three largest emitters of the world, China, United States, and India, all committed to this. And if India can join before the inauguration day of a new president coming into the White House, that's going to make sure the current president, President Obama, is going to have this legacy. And secondly, it's also going to make sure, even if the American people elected the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party, Mr. Donald Trump, who is not likely to commit to himself to this specific deal, the U.S. could still be in this for 4 years because the rules already set over there. So, will Mr. Modi present a beautiful gift eventually?
Well, I think Prime Minister Modi has changed India's entire approach to climate change by being very constructive rather than basically opposing a lot of these climate agreements. We saw that, for example, in France, where the Indian delegation played a very constructive role. And after Prime Minister Modi came to office 2 years ago, the Indian delegations at these climate conferences have played a very constructive role. Allow me to remind you that India, China and the United States are going to be very soon the 3 largest economies of the world.
Right.
And each of them have got a very strongly multiplying relationships with each other. So I don't believe there's going to be any long-term tension between them. Whatever tension is there has been created, in my view, by a certain amount of vested interest from outside the 3 countries who are trying to instigate one or the other country against the other 2. I think it's very important for India, China and the United States to work together. I think you've got a very wise leadership in President Xi Jinping. And certainly from the United States side, I don't believe Donald Trump is going to make a difference. I think he's going to understand the practicality. So in my view, I see growing cooperation. We have seen that between the US and China, and now India is coming in the mix precisely because India is also growing, and India is going to become part of the trinity of the top 3 countries.
The sunshine Professor Nalapat. Thank you so much for bringing us a very optimistic views about the future of the world and the 3 countries. But for now, we have to wrap it up. Time is up. Thank you so much, the 3 of you, for sharing with us your perspective from your different angles. Lily here in Beijing, Madhav Nalapat in India, and also Jeff Smith in the US. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. Thailand's now infamous Tiger Temple is accused of animal trafficking just weeks after the controversial death of an endangered silverback gorilla in the U.S. So how can we balance our economic and entertainment needs against rights of captive animals? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. For many years, controversy has raged over Thailand's Tiger Temple, where tourists are able to get within close proximity of the endangered beasts reared by monks on temple grounds. Some have claimed the tigers are drugged to make them docile, while others say unregulated breedings of tigers sets a dangerous precedent. Until recently, the Tiger Temple had been protected from investigation, but now that seems to have changed.
For years, the Tiger Temple has been one of the most popular tourist destinations in Thailand. Visited by hundreds of thousands, who bring in over $5 million a year in revenue. The monks claim to have pacified the king of the jungle, but controversy has raged for some time about the ability of the monks to look after their cats. Even more surprising is that the temple was recently awarded a zoo license by the Department of National Parks, despite several tigers having been reported as missing by the temple's own vet, Dr. Somchai Visasmongkolchai. However, the monks at the temple claim the vet himself killed the tigers and stole the records of the tigers that remain.
The old vet told the media that some tigers are missing, and the temple has been selling tigers. We are counting to see if the data matches, and we are not going to discuss the closure of the temple today.
Adding to the confusion is that the accused abbot of the temple and the vet both seem to have disappeared. Some believe that a tragedy has occurred.
They're gone. I believe that.
Where do you think they've gone?
I think the claims of Dr. Somchai seem to be correct. I think the tigers have been taken away from the temple, probably cut into pieces and sold.
In response to the poor conditions under which the tigers have been kept, the Department of National Parks has removed 10 tigers and announced it would remove the other 146 this year. Meanwhile, the truth seems to be emerging. On Tuesday, police found what they believe is a slaughterhouse and tiger holding facility used in a suspected animal trafficking network.
This place has been used as a holding facility for the Tiger Temple. It appears they traded live and slaughtered animals. So today we have a court warrant to search this place, and we will expand the investigation to include the owner.
The investigation will continue. But some are asking, should animals be recreational consumer goods in the first place?
And for more on the Thailand's Tiger Temple, we are joined in London by Ms. Shruti Suresh, who is a senior wildlife campaigner from the Environmental Investigation Agency, which is committed to protecting the natural world from environmental crime and abuse. At least that's what the organization claims. Meanwhile, in Nottingham, we are having Mr. Rob Lambert, assistant professor from the University of Nottingham. He's a multidisciplinary academic working in environmental history and also tourism and the environment. Welcome to both of you to our program. Why did it take so long, Ms. Suresh, in India? After all, the authorities claim they want to investigate this specific place for more than 10 years, and only now it happened.
That's right. Allegations linking the Tiger Temple to animal abuse and tiger trafficking date back several years. So the action that the government has taken at this stage is long overdue. But we do commend the Thai Department of National Parks, the DNP, for taking this bold action. We suspect that the challenges they faced in terms of this facility being a temple, being linked with spirituality, being a major tourist attraction, were some of the reasons for the delay in actually taking bold action against this facility. And in particular, we'd also like to congratulate the DNP for working with NGOs on the ground. Two of the NGOs that have been working intensely on this issue, the Wildlife Friends Foundation for Thailand and Sea for Life, continue to work with the DNP to try and seize these products and the animals in the facilities and to end the role that this facility has played in trade.
Okay, we will not do much promotion for any of the specific organizations that are involved. We are trying to get into the story. So, Mr. Lambert, let me ask you, what about it, of this investigation? I mean, there are still a lot of accusations not being approved yet. So when you have already such a wide spread story against the Tiger Temple, is it fair, some would also argue?
I think this story is very welcome. And I think that all of us who care about our relationship with the natural world should celebrate this investigation. To me, it's part of this wider academic picture of us reinterpreting and reevaluating our relationship with tigers. The British, of course, don't have a great historical story with tigers. We shot them in the 19th century, well into the 20th century for sport. But now tigers have become, if you like, recreational destinations in themselves. And this investigation and our re-questioning of what sort of tourism we want with tigers, I think is a very dynamic part of the story that will be taken forward. And I would always be on the side of wild tiger ecotourism rather than this captive tourism.
But how many among us will be able to go into the wilderness to get close to tigers? And if we do that, Mr. Lambert, that could also create other issues. For example, overpopulated tourists into the wilderness that would destroy the environment, not only challenging the tigers, but also challenging many other animals in the wild. Also, of course, there's the issue of human being safety as well if they're going into the wilderness and encounter wild animals. So which plan is better at this moment?
I think here in the Western world there has been a real shift away. You can see that in the way that we have reacted to SeaWorld. There's been a great shift in the way that we've embraced ecotourism, and we want to see these animals in the wild. Zoos, particularly badly run ones, are slipping out of favour. My vision for tigers as part of a conservation strategy is one where there's a vibrant ecotourism connection. It is well orchestrated, well planned, where the money is pumped back into local communities, where they benefit, where the tigers themselves benefit in conservation initiatives, and where NGOs are heavily involved from the outset. So the future is, if you like, I think, very well planned, organised and managed tiger ecotourism, where numbers of tourists are themselves capped.
Okay, Mr. Lambert, if I could just follow up very briefly with you before I go to our other panelists. This is a very long list you just said Of course, if all sides are being satisfied, that would be great. But how could one plan be able to make so many players happy? That is a big question mark. And secondly, it is not a rare thing that many of the Western tourists, they come to developing countries to do tourism that in their own countries they would not be able to do. It is not lack of examples of that. So on the one hand, are we having double standards in this regard? And secondly, are you going to plan that will make everybody happy? Will that plan come immediately? Or we have to wait for decades until economies are developing to the Western standards to make that happen? Mr. Lambert, very briefly from you before I go to Mr. Suresh. Mr. Lambert. I heard some siren sounds over there, but
I think the vision is a partnership. Yeah, the vision is a partnership between government, NGOs, law enforcement agencies, ecotourism operators, and the tourists themselves, who, as you quite rightly say, have to take responsibility for their actions and their connections with nature when they travel abroad. It is no use being a tourist in Britain and caring about nature and then taking a very cavalier attitude towards it when you are in India or China or other parts of the world. I do think there is a move away from captive tourism experiences to more wild, if you like, nature tourism, ecotourism, wilderness tourism experiences.
Right. Ms. Suresh, you are the expert, I guess, when it comes to when it comes to the issues in Asia. For example, this specific temple is having its proceeds coming from those so-called entertainment related to the animals, particularly tiger, eventually to support the temple, which they argue could eventually benefit people in the surrounding areas, because this temple is supposed to be a place where many people go for spiritual help. So in that regard, they seem to be having their argument, and that seems to be valid to a certain extent. So in that regard, what do you make of the preconditions that Mr. Lambert just argued over there? In a place as poor as Thailand, will the beautiful dream list of Mr. Lambert come into being in the immediate future?
I absolutely agree with Dr. Lambert that much more can be generated through ecotourism. I come from India, where I have had the good fortune to see a tiger in the wild, and the experience does not compare with anything that you would see in these facilities. The organization I work for, the Environmental Investigation Agency, has been investigating facilities like the Tiger Temple, tiger farms in Thailand, tiger farms in China, Laos, where we have seen that the trade from these facilities has an impact on the last remaining wild tigers. Captive tiger trade has an impact on poaching in India and Nepal and Thailand, and indeed in other countries that have the last remaining wild tigers. So what we are calling for is the closure of these facilities, because there is no doubt that there is a link in terms of stimulating demand for tiger parts and products and undermining enforcement efforts. Rangers and enforcement officers in India and Nepal are risking their lives to save these amazing species, and we need to be supporting them as much as possible. And that would mean that all of these facilities that are feeding into the tiger trade, and I'm talking about not just Thailand, but that's Laos, Vietnam and China, they need to take stock of the number of captive tigers in their countries and to start taking measures to closing these facilities. In Thailand, it's not just the Tiger Temple. We're talking about at least 24 facilities containing more than 1,450 tigers in captivity. In China, we're talking about more than 5,000 tigers in tiger farms and other big facilities. One of the largest facilities in northern China has more than 1,300 tigers. That's nearly 10 times the size of the Tiger Temple. And this has, as recently as April this year, been implicated in the tiger trade. So all of these countries need to be working together to end demand, end tiger trade, so that we can achieve the ultimate goal of zero poaching, zero demand, which is the only way we will be able to save the wild tigers.
We see that's happening in India. We see that's happening in some other countries also that are having breeds of tigers. But that though, many are looking at the economic root of this problem. If we also take a look at the revenue coming from the tiger temple that's originally from those tigers, visitors are charged an entry fee of 600 Thai baht. That's about $16 with additional cost to pet or feed the tigers. With thousands of people flocking to the temple every year, the annual income estimated to be around 100 million Thai baht, or about 2.8 million US dollars. That's certainly a lot of money over there. We do not know necessarily as to how the money is being spent. That is, I guess, part of the investigation. Having said that, though, Ms. Suresh, as a Animal Protection Agency worker yourself, you know very well that many of the governments, including here in China, have already issued quite strict regulations to protect wild animals from being poached or killed or captivated. However, there have been a very strong cultural root in the trafficking of animals, for example, believing certain parts of the animal be used for medicine and many other things. This has a lot to do with the cultures. How fast the regulations can be implemented and how well can the regulations be implemented is a big question mark, especially when we are talking about poaching in the wilderness. Ms. Suresh.
I think you've raised a very good issue about the laws and regulations in these countries. What we've found that in China and in Laos, the laws do permit a legal permitted trade in captive tiger parts and products, and we believe that this is a huge loophole in the system. The Environmental Investigation Agency has come across a taxidermist, for example, in China, who was selling a captive tiger skin rug for luxury home decor, and this came with a permit issued by the State Forestry Administration, the government of China. And he also went on to speak about how he abuses this system and how he's also involved in processing wild tiger skins sourced from India, and how it's very easy to manipulate the system. So this is a big loophole, and indeed regulations and laws need to be addressed. They need to clearly prohibit all trade in tiger parts and products. And as you said, laws and regulations also need to be enforced. It's not just that you have them on paper, they need to be converted into action on the ground.
Mr. Lambert, a lot of economic interests are being involved, and countries that Ms. Suresh mentioned, a lot of them are developing countries or very poor countries in Asia and in Africa. So we have seen very similar issues with other endangered animals, that the poaching could be a big problem, even though the government and also the local communities sent out their volunteer groups, even the police, our forestry police, going into the wilderness in order to catch these people, to prevent things from happening. Some of them even lost their lives. We have movies here in China talking about how some of the forestry police try to protect the wild animals, but really lost their lives in large amount even. But still, things like that happen. So once again, I'm talking about the efficiency of issues like this. How far are we really from the ideal? And eventually, it's a debate about development stage. It's a debate of the ultimate relations between animals and also human beings.
Absolutely. And in the 21st century, that debate is changing and evolves over time from region to region. For me, one of the key issues here is the way that we globally, as a world community, value tigers as part of a global natural heritage, as part of our images of the wild. In a sense, tigers, their symbolism transcends national boundaries. It's also about, I think, how we value nature. Do we value it financially? Or do we value it spiritually, emotionally, romantically? And there are conflicts there that are being played out in developed as well as developing nations. I'm a great believer in not only for wild tigers that impact on livestock, but also for any rehabilitated tigers from this temple that I hope will eventually, through philanthropy and other areas of NGO work, be put back into reserves so that they can live a better life than they've been living in this temple.
Right.
So in the end, it's about how we value nature, and it's in the end ultimately about how we relate to predators in the 21st century. And in my view, a tiger that is alive is worth more than a tiger that is in parts.
And also, Ms. Suresh, the same question to you. Similar stories a few years ago with Tibetan antelopes as well. The furs of it are mainly consumed in the West at the time by the richest countries' consumers. But of course, that story has been one, and we see another one with tigers and many other animals. So the question, once again, is the global view of our relations with the wildness and also with the animals. Very briefly, we've got 30 seconds for you. Please respond. Thank you.
This is a global issue indeed, and in a few months the UN Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species meets in South Africa, where the issue of tiger farming, the issue of Tibetan antelope, and indeed the issue of ivory trade will be on the table. We hope that countries like Thailand, China, Laos and Vietnam come together to announce that they will not support tiger farming at this conference.
Well, we are going to see a lot of different interest groups involved in those discussions. Of course, you have already voiced yours from your organization's perspective. Thank you so much, Ms. Shruti Suresh, who also Mr. Robert Lambert. Thank you so much for being with us, the two of you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You will be able to find us, or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.